Whooping Crane Chronicles is a collection of stories to learn from, to ponder, and to celebrate. I'm Mike Forsberg, a conservation photographer from the Great Plains. I've spent the last 5 years, camera in hand, exploring the natural history of whooping cranes across the continent, meeting the people who love them, and discovering how these tall, magnificent, and rarest of cranes are navigating our 21st century world. This podcast elevates conservation stories and uplifts these birds to showcase their natural history and beauty in the hope of keeping these birds around for generations to come. Join me on the journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Whooping Crane Chronicles. Today, we are along the Platte River in south central Nebraska at the beginning of spring migration. On this episode, we'll be chatting with Barry Hartup and Dave Brandt, who have spent most of their careers working on whooping crane recovery efforts. Hi, Dave. Hi, Barry.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Mike.
Thanks for taking the time today. Do we say Dr. Barry?
If you choose.
Dr. Barry. Dr. Barry. So I'm going to start with you. We're going to do some introductions first.
Okay.
So Dr. Barry Hartup.
I'm Barry Hartup. I am a recently retired veterinarian that worked with the International Crane Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin. I had a dual appointment with the University of Wisconsin-Madison and worked with cranes, starting back in the summer of 1986 as an intern with the International Crane Foundation. But really picked it up when I became their director of veterinary services in 2000. And kind of primary goal number one was working with whooping cranes in the reintroduction project in the eastern United States to establish a breeding population.
So Wisconsin to Florida.
Yeah. Goes to the southeastern U.S. So yeah, that's kind of where things kicked off.
Huh. And where were you born and raised?
I was born in Iowa City.
You're an Iowan?
I play that down quite a bit because of the guy to my left. No, originally I was a Gopher. As my
Gopher?
A Gopher. My
Minnesota
father got a faculty job at the University of Minnesota, and so I grew up a Minnesotan. If you can't hear that in my voice,
you just accentuated
Minnesotan.
Yeah, say boat.
But and Dave also knows this. The Vikings broke my heart 4 times as a child, and so going to school at University of Wisconsin in Madison, I became a Badger, and that's what I consider myself now.
You know, they're the same colors as my alma mater, the Nebraska Cornhuskers.
Yes, I know.
Many a battle on the court and on the field.
You got it.
Yeah. Dr. Brandt, do we call you Dr. Brandt?
No, please don't. No, I never reached that status. My name is Dave Brandt. Recently retired, so you're dealing with a couple retirees today.
Yeah.
Recently retired wildlife biologist from Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center, who is part of the United States Geological Survey. And I worked there for, about 33 years before retiring last June. I started my career and had great ambitions to be a waterfowl biologist, but was diverted in 1996 on a crane, on an emergency crane project, I guess you'd call it, as much as anything. My former boss had done some work in the Platte River here 20 years prior to that date. And there was an event that allowed us a research opportunity, so he asked me if I was willing to quickly mobilize and come down to the Platte River and collect some data that we could use as a preliminary assessment of, time-based change. It's very rare to get a research opportunity to do comparisons with 20-year gaps. So that was the reason, or that was how I got started with cranes. We did actually find some potentially significant changes in the cranes, and I started full bore starting in 1997 and worked probably over 12, 13 years down here in the Platte River, where I met you, Mike.
I was just going to say.
Made a long time friendship during those years. So yeah, I grew to love the Platte River and the cranes here through that time period, and lost a lot of sleep and caught a lot of cranes.
Well, it's good to be back here now, isn't it?
It is.
Doing the same thing that you
It is. It's
20-some years ago.
life comes full circle, right?
What are you two guys doing here anyway? You're here on the Platte. You're both retired. You should be down. It's
my spring break.
Sun City or
It's my spring break
spring
trip.
break.
You know, it's 10, 20 degrees warmer here, so, and a little sunnier.
Why are you two here?
I'm here because I heard one of my ICF colleague, Andy Caven, who's director of North America programs for the International Crane Foundation. He said something about wanting to do a study with the Crane Trust with sandhill cranes. And so I volunteered, said, I'm not doing anything in March of next year. I'll put it on my calendar.
Yeah.
But Dave is the main man with this project. So,
Well, yeah,
I want to
Andy
give the
and I guess the Crane Trust knew my history down here. I did probably do a little more work than anybody with as far as capturing cranes down here. So in order for them to accomplish their goals, they need to capture some cranes to put transmitters on them. So I am down here trying to pass on some of the knowledge that I gained over the close to 15 plus years down here that I've been coming on and off, so that they can kind of carry on or learn those techniques, carry them on into the future, and enable them to collect the information that would allow them to do the things they need to do to benefit the resource down here.
You guys in the blind together today?
We were not. I had Abraham in the blind.
Oh, yeah, Abe.
I let him sleep. You know, he's older than me, so he needs more sleep than me. So I let him get a few extra hours of sleep this morning.
where Andy and I kind of had long conversation in the truck.
Yeah, I see. Okay.
Solved all the rest of the world's problems there.
Well, we'll
We
circle.
ran the gamut.
We'll circle back to how the how-to of crane trapping, what all that entails, because it is ridiculous how much that entails, and you just never, I never in my wildest dreams understood how you could actually capture these birds that are very wary birds, and the methods that that it takes now, but have evolved, I'm sure, over time.
Oh, yeah.
But let's go back to the first time. Do you two remember the first time you met each other? And then do you remember the first time you worked together with each other? Because you two are real simpatico with each other. You're both very different. And I know you get under each other's skins once in a while. But there is a bond. There is a bond here.
I've been told we're like an old husband and wife, but
I'm not going to ask who's who.
Pretty different. Would I have met you? Did you go to Sacramento?
I did not. I did not. I do think that our first interaction was probably one of the crane workshops. So
In Mexico.
Actually, in Mexico.
Okay.
Former colleague of ours, Felipe Chavez Ramirez, and the North American Crane Working Group put together an international meeting in Mexico for the first time. They had met in Canada previously, but in a city in north central Mexico, Zacatecas,
Which is
really about the southern limit of sandhill cranes in North America.
Yeah.
And it brought everybody together, and
You guys hit it off right away.
we just probably, like I said, we had a hard time remembering where we met.
well, the funny thing is I remember the borough and the
whatever that Caledonia or whatever that thing is called.
Burrow? Are we talking a hole in the
I
ground
missed it.
or a-
I missed it.
Carrying,
That was part of the
they
problem.
throw a barrel of mezcal on a burro, and you parade through town with a mariachi band and stop at the little town squares and dance and drink. Oh yeah, it's a blast, man. That's my favorite remembrance.
It's too bad we didn't have social media back then.
Well, and then the first time we sort of got thrown together, working together, was with the with the whooping crane
2009,
project. Yeah, and this crack team trying to capture whooping cranes down in Texas for, I believe, the first time ever.
Yes.
Because chicks had been worked with previously by Canadian biologists, but
Yeah, they had never captured adults on the winter year-round. That was fairly something new. That there was, for a lot of reasons, there was a lot of hoops that needed to be jumped through to basically enable that to happen. And then also, it's just difficult. I mean, Tom Stain, the current at that time, the whooping crane coordinator, basically told us we were not going to succeed. And of course, so that just made me a little
More
bit
determined?
more determined that I would succeed. But
You want to talk about why are we capturing cranes down there in 2009? What was the impetus for that? And then talk a little bit about how that all came together.
well, I got to credit Felipe Chavez Ramirez with that, because I mean, through my stint here at the Platte River, I heard all these things, and people were always talking about this or that on the Platte River for whooping cranes and how important it was. And I kept asking Felipe, where are all the whooping cranes? I mean, I just didn't get it. And it quickly became very apparent to me that there was not a whole lot of real solid information on what was happening with whooping cranes as they moved through here. A lot of it was based on observation, and a lot of it was just kind of people passing down stuff through time. And I was like, why don't we have this? This is silly. We have the technology to basically address these questions that everybody seems to have. And so Felipe and I, we talked a lot about a lot of things over campfires here in the Platte. And so Felipe was the one who kind of got that ball rolling and got the permits in place and got the okay and got the sign off from the recovery team, I believe, needed its blessing. And so, yeah, be careful what you wish for sometimes, right? So
Yeah.
that's how it all happened, and it happened kind of suddenly. I mean, they kind of asked me if I'd be willing to be involved, and just because of my experience with handling cranes and all the cranes that I'd caught, but I had no idea what to do with whooping cranes. I mean, they're a world different than sandhill cranes. So I just kind of said, okay, man, I'll come and watch and help you out where I can. So that's kind of where it started, is I was asked to join the team. Of course, Barry can tell you why he was, and it makes total sense why Barry was involved. So,
well, Felipe and I had I received my invitation. So I had known him from the Zacatecas meeting and I think a couple of other interactions. And he invited me to the Platte in March of 2008, I believe. We signed that agreement with a handshake right across the river from where we're sitting right now.
I'll be darned.
That was my first visit to the Platte. It was wonderful. Just absolutely magical visit. And it was such an honor to get asked to join the team, I think, again, because we had this really neat synergy within the North American crane kind of world. And I interacted with several of these folks. They sort of, one, filled the kind of the obligation to have like an animal welfare officer or expert, in the team in case something were to go terribly wrong. But two, that, maybe we can add a little something into that team too. And this guy has also been working with whooping cranes, yes, mostly in captivity, but a little bit in the field work through the reintroductions for, by that time, 7-8 years. So it complements basically the other kinds of experiences that the team members have had. So I've had a lot of opportunities to handle and manipulate whooping cranes safely, and for both them and the people involved. And that was important, I think.
So what was that first season like? What do you remember?
This is why I wish I had access to my photos. I have a great photo where I took, I guess, what would be a lame 2009 looking selfie. And I have this is in a blind. And I'm looking at the camera and looking kind of jaunty, and Dave's like giving me the evil eye. And that's how I remember. That is how we're different.
Tell him why I was giving you the evil eye, Barry.
Because I'm moving and doing things I shouldn't be doing in a blind.
Or maybe because he was wearing a bright yellow raincoat.
Believe me, I'm getting to that one. Because I shocked him also with just being, what was it? It's because I saw the horrific forecast for that first few weeks. If you remember, it was really wet. We were fighting a lot of bad weather. And I just brought a raincoat. Well, yeah, it's not not field certified. Okay? And
Not Dave certified.
no, and the other picture is the goofy soft-sided cooler I decided to get at the local Walmart because I didn't have one.
Yeah.
And the only thing I could come up with was a Superman
Spider-Man.
or Spider-Man.
Come on.
Spider-Man soft-sided cooler to sort of hold, the blood samples and other kinds of things.
He's iconic, dude.
So it was awesome.
It's a good thing.
Yellow slicker and Spider-Man cooler.
We have extras on this podcast, so we will get those photographs.
All right.
All right. Well, besides various shenanigans of improperly dressed attire and all that stuff,
I'm in a blind.
in a blind, I know. What do you remember about that, Dave?
The first field season, I remember incredible frustration.
Yes.
That's what I remember, both situation based and also just, I had told myself on this trip that I don't know nothing about whooping cranes. I don't know nothing about catching whooping cranes. I know a little bit about catching sandhills, but that's the best I got.
So put the listeners sort of in Dave Brandt's head. You've got to do this. Where do you start?
Felipe Chavez Ramirez had a technique that he was going to use, the capture technique sort of adapted from his work with Cuban
sandhills.
Cuban
I
sandhill
was going to
cranes.
ask that, where you got that. So,
Which is basically a foot snare type mechanism. Very non-traumatic, but there's a fair amount of wishful thinking involved in terms of predictability for where the bird is literally going to put its foot.
yeah.
It's a 1 square foot spot it has to step on.
And it was extremely difficult to get the cranes to cooperate in that manner, but we strangely got lucky to some degree capturing 2 birds in that field season, was within the first 2 weeks. But
How do you do that?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the take us?
So it's based on activity patterns. If you can get predictable activity patterns, then you can basically figure out where to place this thing so they have a high probability of stepping on it. Mm-hmm. So that involves basically baiting these birds to spots, which these birds are coming to private deer feeders in Texas anyway. So
As part of their daily regime.
as part of their daily regime. I mean, that's, people do it down there for various reasons. Some people are hunters that just have them out for actually hunting purposes, and other people actually have them out for bird watching experiences, to get the birds to come to their yards and whatnot. So we took advantage of that. We actually were trying to do it on the refuge as well with our own techniques to try and get them patterned to come, but we were not having very good success doing that. So we ended up working pretty much exclusively, or our success was exclusively on private lands.
Yeah, grape tomatoes weren't working.
I've got those pictures, trust me. Yeah, that was one of Felipe's brainchilds.
Great tomato.
Well, they look just like big wolfberries.
As a stand-in for
Wolfberries.
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 Yeah. So these were wolfberries on steroids, and if they ate wolfberries, they should be attracted. We can at least get them to come look at them, right? Yeah,
We'll get you that photo.
that was how far down the rabbit hole we went. So anyway, that was part of the other frustration. I mean, I saw this contraption that Felipe had, and I was like, "Are you serious?" I mean, I just didn't see how it was going to be very efficient or work very well.
So its efficiency was questionable for sure. Its safety was not.
Yep.
This would hold fast a bird for a short period of time, we would be able to come in from a distant point from the blind at which we were at and safely restrain the bird and do what we needed to do to mark them with the telemetry devices and take a sample. The hope would be to know what sex of bird we're looking at so that we sex them through sort of a DNA fingerprinting. Learn a few other things from them and then send them on their way. But if you're not catching them, you're burning a lot of time. And
we spent what, 6 weeks or more down there,
Yes.
probably,
Yeah.
And you caught two?
to catch two.
Yeah. So you caught those two birds, and what did you put on those birds?
We were using satellite GPS transmitters. So basically, it's a unit that collects GPS locations at a set duty cycle, at set intervals, and then uses orbiting satellites to transmit that information back to a central repository that we can gain access to.
Okay.
So that's what we were doing. It was mounted above their hock on a leg. It was something that was very similar. It was the same thing that I had used on all the sand hills that I'd been marking. So we'd marked, probably at that point, 230 sand hills or something with that same type of transmitter, or very similar, and another probably 400 or 500 with similar VHF style, just a standard telemetry that you see that most people know about, where you get these beeps and you gotta use a what's called a Yagian antenna to kind of home in on that signal. Mm-hmm. So we felt very comfortable. We assessed that. We'd assessed the impacts on those sand hills, tried to find any of the negative impacts that we were having, and we were fairly confident that we were not impacting their breeding, biology and things like that. So, I think we felt that it was worth the risk to put them on whooping cranes and get the same and similar information.
Did you also, on those first whooping cranes that you captured, were you also putting colored bands on those birds too?
We did. We put we put both, actually, colored leg bands, and we also had unique identifiers on the transmitter band itself. Mm-hmm. So we had kind of redundant ways of keeping track of these birds through time.
Yeah. So that was in 2009, you said?
2009.
2009-10, the winters. It gets a little weird down there in Aransas because we cross the New Year. So.
Yeah. How many evolutions or iterations do you think you've had in this project of evolving your capture techniques, evolving your technology? What you're doing today, or what you've done most recently anyway, is in some ways similar to what you started in 2009, but in many ways I'm sure it's quite different, and I'm sure you've learned a lot too. Yeah. So were there any major milestones between then and now that's like, aha, we've solved part of the riddle, or we're going to do something completely different now?
What enabled us was changing the capture techniques, of course. Well, that was a big game changer.
Well, we'll talk about that a little bit.
So like I said, when I started on this project, it was like I had rocket netted all the sand hills, not all, but majority of the sand hills that I had captured in the Central Platte and other places. I also caught birds in Mexico and Arizona. Those places were all using rocket nets, which is a very, very traumatic capture experience and potentially dangerous. Things can go wrong. And, as with any capture technique, things can go wrong. But rocket netting is definitely something that I decided I will not be involved with whooping cranes.
So explain just in a sentence or two what rocket netting is for people who have no idea.
Okay, so rocket netting for sand hills in particular involves about a 60-foot by 40-foot net that's propelled by 4 8-pound rockets that have ports that exhaust comes out, and that's what pulls the net forward, and it's very fast. From the time you launch that net to the time it's over the birds and on the ground is under 2 seconds.
Wow.
So it's a very, very fast technique, and it's very effective. It's used a lot on waterfowl. That's kind of its main glory, I guess you'd say, is for using to capture numbers of birds, right? Which we weren't necessarily after, even with sandhills. That wasn't our goal. Our goal was not to catch as many sandhills as we possibly could. We wanted to catch small groups and radio one individual out of that group maybe. But it was the only effective technique that I could utilize and find and perfect to actually efficiently capture sandhill cranes with the numbers of transmitters that we needed to put out.
So you weren't going to do that with whooping cranes.
So I was not, absolutely not. If they were going to ask me to do it, I did not want my name in the headlines of a newspaper as a guy who had caused a mortality on a whooping crane during scientific capture activities. I was amazed that we thought we were going to be very effective with what we were doing, but I just kind of give it a chance, man. So I mean, we did catch a few birds, but we knew that it was not going to be good enough to get the sample that we were interested in. Two birds a year.
Didn't we catch just one bird?
We caught one bird the next year.
2011 in January of 2011. So you had 3 birds after 2 winters of
12 weeks.
How many weeks of effort between not just two of us, but 2 or 3 other people as well.
Yeah.
And so it was you coming, as I recall, when you came for the trapping in 2011-12, you had said, well, what about surgical tubing and something where we could have this elastic band that's somehow incorporated into some kind of a snare type device, and how do we automate it?
To back up, the one bird we caught in 2010-11 was caught with a fishing pole snare.
What is that?
So it was something that another colleague of ours, Marty Folk, had developed and used
in Florida
on I believe it was sandhills is what they were, and some of the whooping cranes that they were introducing down there, but very different environment. I mean, these birds you could basically stand 50 feet from them. It was a loop that they put around a pile of bait. He actually did an excavation so that he could kind of put the snare around the rim, and then there was a pile of bait in the middle, and then they would actually could see them put their foot in there, and that would put their foot down so that when he closed the noose, pulled the fishing pole that closed the noose around their lower leg, and captured them. So we did that.
So you're in a blind 50 feet away.
Well, at least 50 feet away. That's the difference between what he was dealing with versus what we were dealing with. We were dealing with wild birds.
Yeah.
Even though they were coming to be people's feeders, they still were extremely wary and leery of people. So it was not so simple. So yes, we had blinds out in the salt marsh in a very, very remote habitat oftentimes, or on the edge of it, and trying to do this and communicate it, right? Because whereas Marty did it, he could sit there and watch the bird with himself, just holding a fishing pole in plain sight.
Yeah.
And when the bird was right, he'd set the hook, for lack of a better word.
Literally fishing.
Right. Whereas we could not get away with that. So we had people in the blind. Felipe's in the blind, watching with his binoculars, and I'm outside the blind, laying on the ground with a fishing pole so that the birds don't see me when they're flying or when they're there. And then when they're there and about ready, he's got to communicate to me outside the blind, okay, man, they're getting ready. We got birds about ready. Get ready, Dave. And then you got to wait for just the right time because you don't want to snare the bird's neck or head. Mm-hmm. So you got to wait for it to get its foot in the right position. And then as soon as it lifts its head, you got to pull, and you don't want it to put its head back down in the interim. I mean, so it's very complicated, right? So anyway, we were successful, but it was not simple. And so that's when I kind of said, we need to remove this communication thing and the human out of this system. So that's where I came up with trying to figure out a way to make it remote, make it non-human powered. And that's what I showed up in 11-12 with, an idea of how to do that. And it was surgical tubing, which was very, very soft.
And you had the radio control at that
and I put a remote activated trigger that used radio control, basically like RC car type components that would actually pull the trigger. So we could sit there and watch it and instantly fire that when we needed to.
So Dave's a tinkerer.
I'm a tinker.
He's a MacGyver.
He is a MacGyver. He's the MacGyver. So he shows up with this, and it's great. And then it sort of developed from there, and we had some success, some failures, and then refinements through.
Actually, we had a lot of failures. If you remember, I know exactly what we had. We went 1 for 12.
Well, the tube freezing. That's what I remember.
Outside of that, yes, we did. We learned some
Tubing
stuff.
loses elasticity as you get to 32 degrees.
Actually, no, it's under 45.
45.
Yep, at 45 degrees, a stretched surgical tubing will not contract upon itself,
It goes.
which is crazy. Yeah, it's like it ends up like a stiff spaghetti noodle. So who'd have thunk that, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, but we did. So we were using that, and yes, we had a failure, I think, with cold temperatures once, but we also had birds that were getting in the right position, and we were firing it, and we were missing them. So we had birds like there, on the spot, and I'm like, they're there. Hit the trigger, boom, and we don't get them. I'm like, what the heck? They were there. Why did we not do that? Mm-hmm. Well, we went, like I said, we caught one bird out of 12 attempts when we fired that. And so that means the bird was perfect, and we fired it, and we missed 11. And we caught one, which is absolutely, for me as a hunter, and how I approach things, you cannot afford to educate your quarry unsuccessfly because they learn at that point. So I was just like, man, with only 100 and whatever there was at that time, 200 birds in the population, something like that, 250.
Yeah.
You know, we can't be affording to do that too many times.
You said 5%, figure it out. Yeah, right there.
Exactly.
So what did you do?
So the problem is we got caught in this do loop, right? It's like, God, but it should work. They're there. How come we're not catching them? They're there. Well, we figured out in kind of going back through the films that we were taking video at the time. Yeah. And so we could go back through, and what was happening is the sand down there is so soft that when the birds came up to step into the depression so that we knew they were in the depression, they would actually catch it with their hallux, which is this elevated appendage, right?
It's analogous to their thumb.
Yeah, like analogous to their thumb.
Yeah.
They were catching that line, stepping in the sand, and the sand was giving way, and that we're catching the snare on the rim and dragging it into the bottom of the depression we had. So we couldn't know when we fired exactly what the situation was, because oftentimes sometimes we had 3, 4, 5, 6 birds come up to the hole at the time and actually start feeding and back off. And so we have to wait until they're all gone and get just one bird in. So it was a mess. So finally, I said, I know how to fix this. We just got to stop. We got to stop. We got to retool. It's going to take me 2 or 3 days, but we can fix this. I know. I got an idea.
More MacGyver.
Yep, I got an idea.
Dave the material scientist. Yeah.
So that's what we did. We finally just said, let's stop, guys. We got to stop, man. Or this is madness. This is madness.
So you went to the hardware store.
Well, we went to several hardware stores.
The marine tackle shop.
Yep, marine tackle shops. I mean, we were bouncing all over that coast. But what I ended up doing with the help of everybody and even the biologist at Aransas is making a fiberglass rim that went around the perimeter of that hole, kind of incorporating fiberglass in the sand to make it blend in. Mm-hmm. And then I cut a small groove all the way around the interior, just under the lip of that fiberglass, that I could put the snare into, and we could put sand in there to hide the snare. And then if they stepped in and dragged, they wouldn't catch the snare, right, and it blend right in. So we did that. We got it. It's kind of funny because my supervisor, Aaron, was coming down that night, and Brad, the biologist at Aransas, and myself were actually working on that until 1 o'clock in the morning. We were going out to trap the next morning, and Aaron's plane got in at 3. So I drove to Corpus Christi, picked up Aaron, came back, took Aaron out the next day, and we caught 12 birds in 10 days or something like that, or 9 days using that.
So it was a major technological fix, and it was safety tested.
Oh, yes.
because some of the other materials refinement was with the actual line that was used for the snare. We had inherited a braided fishing line that our Florida colleague had brought way back
Carpenter line it was.
or something, two years prior. And then we sort of were using that consistently. I don't know if it ever came up should we use a larger gauge monofilament line or not. I think people were, for whatever reason, maybe a little reluctant to that. Well, we actually tried this reconfigured mechanism and said it has to be comfortable for ourselves if it's going to be comfortable for a crane. And so we did this. We just sort of figured out what kind of forces are being deployed here. Are we overpowering the birds in an inappropriate way just to catch them?
Yeah.
And I don't have the scar anymore, but for a couple of years I did. I put my arm down in there and we caught that. And boy, that braided line was
Nasty.
not good.
Really?
And we said, no, this would be unacceptable and quite painful when it just tightens.
Yeah.
And again, we're not strangulating anything. We're just catching this, and then it tends to loosen. But we said, no, that initial shock and trauma is not.
Well, part of the reason behind that, Barry, was we went from surgical tubing because it was freezing at temperatures and whatnot. We went to bungee cord.
Bungee cord.
Yep. So we were using a shock cord, bungee cord, shock cord, whatever you want to call it, which is much quicker. So it was closing. I mean, there's no way a person could pull a fishing pole as fast as this shock cord closed that snare loop. And so accompanying that was basically that burn on your wrist of that carpenter's string or whatever you want to call it that Marty had used successfully with his fishing pole. So that was a part of it. And also to his point, yeah, we had to figure out which diameter shock cord, how much force we could put on that. And we ultimately settled on a 1/4 inch, maybe a little bit less than a 1/4 inch shock cord that we used.
And so that, I mean, quite honestly, if I'm not mistaken, with that technique, sure, it's been modified here and there. The fiberglass ring, there's ways to have worked around that now where we don't necessarily need that in each set at all, especially here, say, at the Platte or in Wisconsin and other places we work with cranes and capture them safely. But essentially that technique has stayed static now for that long period of time.
I used it 2 weeks ago in Mississippi to catch Mississippi sandhill cranes.
Is that what you call the Ring of Fire?
Yep, we called it the Ring of Fire. Yep. After all the development and all the pain we went into, Brad and I were a little loopy at this point. I mean, like I said, we were up till 1 o'clock in the morning and going and getting my boss at 3 and driving back and going out trapping at 5 in the morning. So yeah, you get a little loopy.
Well, and then he pulls together his compilation of video clips and sets it to music. To Johnny Cash.
Again, extras, podcast maybe someday.
Yeah.
I want to show you two guys a picture out of this book here, this old Whooperland book. How many birds have you all captured together, you think?
I believe in phase 1 we marked 60, 61, 62.
I had you for a while because you weren't there in Wood Buffalo.
Yes, I didn't go the first year in Wood Buffalo National Park.
But you quickly surpassed me and have blown me away since.
Yeah, I don't know.
Do you know what the total number within the 2 phases is?
Well, it's still growing, right? I believe we're up to 190 right now, individual. When I say that, that's radio deployments, right?
Sure.
Okay, so that's both on the breeding grounds and the wintering grounds. But yeah, no, I would say we was roughly 50-50 in phase 1. So it was roughly, I think we did 3 bouts on the breeding grounds. So we marked about 30 birds on the breeding grounds, 29 or 30. And the remainder were on the wintering grounds. And then, yeah, we substantially bumped it up in phase 2.
Yeah.
To where we've marked another 100 and 130 birds, I think, total. I mean, Barry's probably been
Should be close to number 2, although my colleagues in Wisconsin.
I just look at it as how many I've been involved with.
Yes.
And I've been involved with, I think I roughed it out, was probably about 160, 100 and somewhere in there. Barry's been all of that.
I'm the super technician, though. See, he's the director.
Yeah. When I started on the swooping crane book project I officially committed to it and got some funding in 2019. And my first trip ever to Texas was to come down and spend time with both of you.
Well, that's where I really got to know you much better.
Well,
I knew of you. But
same here, and we shared a FEMA trailer.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, which was glorious.
multiples.
Yeah. So I know that the 160 plus birds or whatever that you all have captured over the years, and I'm sure there are some that stand out. There are some that you probably can't remember. Others you can go back on your records and sort of recall. For me, the very first whooping crane that I ever saw up close was a bird that I went out with you to capture. This is the picture, photograph on page 212. Caption reads, at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, biologist Dave Brandt and International Crane Foundation veterinarian Barry Hartup assess Brutus before he is affixed with bands and telemetry. Dave's got his stern gaze at Barry because Barry's probably made some smart-ass comment.
That's the action shot.
Yep.
You remember that.
Completely.
It's a lot of windmill.
Yeah, so this was in December, I believe, of 2019.
Yeah, I think so.
And I thought I had, I did. I sort of hit the jackpot right out of the gate because I had the 2 guys that had done this just about more than anybody else. And this bird, when it came into the trap, it came in with an issue. This bird we call Brutus. Dave, you named it Brutus because it was a damn big bird.
Oh, it was.
But it was a weird circumstance.
He was tough.
In a way.
Yeah.
Can you talk about this bird a little bit, either of you?
I want to first ask Dave, did you see that this bird had an injury going in? So that was the kicker. None of us knew that this bird had any kind of wound on it.
Right.
And I want to address that because people are probably asking themselves, wow, you've had 100 and whatever, 69, hundreds of birds that we've dealt with. Have you experienced issues? And yeah, I've had to use my professional skills several times. Only a small, back that up, a small handful of times, but they were necessary in a couple of instances. Mm-hmm. But nothing related to the capture techniques, remarkably. It's basically as close to 100% safety record as you could really get. But this was one instance where when we got to this bird, we thought, oh my God, what just happened here? This bird had bled quite a bit from its throat area. What possibly could have happened or gone wrong in that set, which otherwise, as I recall, was quite routine. Yeah, it was one of those instances where, wait a minute, everything else goes on pause. And the bird safety, as it always has from the very beginning, just becomes absolutely paramount. Is there anything that we can do here to, rectify a situation we may have accidentally brought on to this bird? So,
we had no clue. But if you remember right, we were expecting an earlier capture at that site based upon our intel from camera traps that we had out. But that morning, man, it was just a cacophony in the salt marsh away from us.
Right.
And we were like, what is going on out there? What the heck is, that's crazy. It was just seemed really, really raucous.
Right.
And about 10 o'clock or something like that, this lone bird comes in. And I was like, lone birds, they're part of the population too. I guess we need to sample it. It would be better if it was a pair or family group, but, it's a lone bird. Said if he doesn't, I'm gonna get him. So he immediately went up to the pond and drank and drank and drank and drank. Yeah. And then he wandered over to the ring, to the bait site that we had. He hit the bait that I'd put out for him and started working his way towards the trap. And sure enough, got in right. So we captured him. And yeah, like I said, we had no clue. We hadn't looked at him. I'm amped. I mean, people don't get it, but as a hunter, this is very similar to hunting. Your adrenaline just gets on edge because you're waiting. It's that moment of anticipation. And finally he steps in and okay, boom, I hit it. And I ran up and immediately I seen he had blood on his neck.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh geez, he caught himself with a claw or something, because we have seen instances we saw an instance or two of that where they flail at you because it's a fight or flight, right? You get them, they're caught and they're trying to stay alive. So they start flailing at you and sometimes they catch themselves with their claws on their feet. But anyway, then as we're handling him and putting the hood on him to get him calm, I'm looking and it's like, well, but it's dried. The blood is dried. So obviously it's not a fresh wound. So that's where I said, Barry, man, take care of this, dude.
Right. So on that picture you showed, I had a little ocular setup for magnification and sort of inspected everything, tried to make sure that, there wasn't an issue that could really be, that his airway was clear and that he was breathing okay. And, basically this bird had, a lot of dried blood on its throat area. He's got a pretty significant injury to the upper part of his beak.
Yeah.
And so the question that we kept asking ourselves after that, so we cleaned him up and made sure everything was fine. There really wasn't very much in the end other than to clean the wounds that really needed doing. I don't recall having to stitch him up or do anything like that there was any kind of a cut or serious wound in his mouth. And so we were able to let him go. But whether or not this was all from an interaction with another territorial male,
Some fight. Yeah.
or there could have been some hazard possibly out in the wetland, some kind of fencing or other waste, something like that. I probably was that interaction with other cranes. And he kind of got beat up. But he did great after that.
It fit with the cacophony that we'd heard on the marsh out there, and yeah, to me, the picture just came together pretty quickly once we ascertained that it was not a wound on our part, but it's something that he'd been fighting with another male, probably out there.
Which, to that degree, I don't think too many people really have observed that kind of traumatic outcome too often. Usually it's a chasing off and probably a peck,
But this guy was big, man.
And
he was big and bad.
He was tough. He was strong as an ox. He was,
Yeah, he was lucky you guys caught him that day. And the thing that was really interesting about it is I remember, Dave, that shortly after that capture and release, his telemetry went dark. And we didn't know what the fate was of that bird. And when you released him, you were hopeful, but, could go one way or go the other. And then a couple months later, you and I were in the intercoastal in a boat going either out to a trap site or coming back from a trap site. And there were 4 birds together close to the bay.
Yep.
And
close to where we caught that bird.
Not too far away, yeah, on the Blackjack Peninsula at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, and sure as shit, there he was amongst us. And then he gets up and he flies right over the bow of our boat, which is this picture
On page 8 and 9.
right here, and the beak is completely healed. He looks pretty damn good at that point.
But you know what? Actually,
you can
even
see
in
a little
that
bit,
picture,
right?
you can see the little bit of scarring probably on it.
Just a little bit.
But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It looked great.
So I don't know why he took off and sort of flew over us and then went back. I don't know if he was saying thank you or
Probably something
else.
I thought I saw a middle toe.
But then later, on that spring migration, daughter Elsa and I intercepted him
up in the Sandhills of Nebraska, up near Atkinson, out with another bird that Dave called Christmas tree or boathouse. It was green, red, green, and about 9 other birds that were frogging on this area that was mix of Sandhills, wetland, center pivot, and crop field. And he looked great. In fact, we'll be talking with colleagues of yours, Mark Bidwell and John Conkin, in a podcast down the road about their work up in Wood Buffalo.
In Wood Buffalo, right.
And one of the things that they're doing is putting out game cameras and acoustic recorders near nest sites of selected birds up there on the nesting grounds. And one of the birds in 2022, or was it 2023? That was 2023. They put cameras on, turned out to be Brutus's nest.
I don't think I've heard that.
Which is really cool. In fact, the picture that is in this picture right here, there's Mark and John and Hannah Edwards from the Calgary Zoo. They're installing cameras and acoustics and taking water samples from this nest right there. And those 2 birds that are doing the vampire pose, that's Brutus and his mate.
Yep.
And later,
Continues to be a toughie.
yeah. Well, and just to bring it full circle, that year was a rather dry year. Nest productivity was a little lower than usual, so there was more predation at the nest and so forth. Some of their cameras caught that. And at Brutus's nest, their cameras caught him trying to fend off a black bear, a big-ass black bear, a black bear that ended up coming down, sitting down on that nest on his haunches and picking up each egg and eating it and then walking off. But Brutus lived a tough life, man. I mean, fought bears.
Yep.
How about you guys? But still out there.
And
So
if I remember right, I think he last transmitted here within this year was the last information we got from him. So that's actually been a pretty high performing transmitter too. So.
yeah, it's like 4 years now or so. And I think the last transmission was, I think there was confirmation that he had made it
To Aransas.
to Aransas.
Yes, but it hasn't. It's
Nothing
yet to
since.
dump some of the data. It needs to dump some of the data it has on its memory card within the transmitter. So hopefully we can get him one more ping,
Yeah.
get some of that information.
Do you have other birds that you remember, either of you, or situations that stand out for you?
Well, I would say mine was actually working in Wood Buffalo. It's a very different ask to work with the birds. In Canada, we're not working with the adults. We're working with pre-fledging chicks, birds that are near adult size, but haven't fledged yet, about 2 months of age, right around the 1st of August.
Yeah.
And the captures in Canada in Wood Buffalo National Park really were modeled after work that Canadian Wildlife Service biologist Ernie Kite had conducted in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The nesting grounds at that time were relatively well known. The service would go in the spring and attempt to map the locations of reproductive whooping cranes, their nest sites, and would later visit those same sites in that summer before the birds would fledge at about 3 months, 10 weeks to 12 weeks of age, in order to put trackers on them, to mark them and to follow their migratory course south. This is logistically challenging. How do you get into a roadless wilderness effectively and spy these birds? Well, it's through aircraft. So using either fixed-wing aircraft to initially spot and map those locations and then come back and use a helicopter in such a way that you can get to ground that's firm enough that you can get in and then initiate a capture event which tracking the bird's location, running in as fast as you can in on the ground, and then locating that chick that can't fly away from you, knowing that you would probably be faster, as long as that bird isn't out in water, you would probably be faster than the bird in order to get control of it, and then to put a transmitter on it and let it go, and then they would rejoin with their parents nearly immediately after that, and then the parents would guide that young one south after fledging. So our group included contracted pilots who typically came out of Fort McMurray. So we'd have a professional pilot, we had a 6-passenger A-Star helicopter, but one that could accommodate this 4-person capture team. The pilot, obviously, and then a sort of a co-pilot or observer. Canadian Park Service asked to have one of their biologists sort of observe the goings-on, not necessarily be a part of the capture crew. They typically were used sort of in this spotter type role. So we would be working off that information that was gathered in early June of nesting sites. We would search those areas from a higher altitude. We would spot, hopefully within a short distance from the nesting location, the family group. We did not want to drop in on parents that had 2 chicks because we didn't want to split up the family group in any way. We would find a pair with a single chick, bird that seemed appropriate in terms of size and stature, and then essentially try to find a way where we could be let off as the capture team, which consisted of 4 biologists, a runner, somebody kind of usually pretty small and speedy, who would kind of bolt out of the helicopter first, and then the other 3 with our various roles. We would have a 10-minute window in which to locate the chick and safely restrain it, and then as quickly as we could, we would try to limit the time of our work to about 15 minutes, and then release that bird back into the wild with the tracker.
Hard work.
Extraordinarily hard work. So
hard
our
efforts.
biggest challenge once the family group was located was essentially to scout the immediate area around those birds and to try and evaluate, okay, how much firm ground actually exists there? Is there a viable path between where the helicopter can nearly land? They don't typically literally fully land, they're hovering. We jump out safely, get out from under the rotors, and then we have a relatively dry path to where we think the birds are. Now, during this time, as the helicopter descends and we're let off, those birds could change position quite rapidly. And so then eventually we will have to use the helicopter. The helicopter will gain altitude again and then swing around to the opposite side of the family group and give us basically a mark to start heading towards.
And you're in communication.
And we believe we know what kind of distance we're talking about, but that could decrease or it could increase quite a bit in that time that elapses. The great thing with that particular capture event is, as far as I'm aware, with all of the follow-up observations that the Park Service had done in the days following our work, every one of those family groups had reunited, and those birds did great. And as long as the technology was working, the job was done extraordinarily successfully.
I had the great luxury of being with these guys for a week in 2022. I'd heard your stories, Barry and Dave's, and it blew me away how hard it was and how damn good all of you are and have been in this process. It's a well-oiled machine, and once in a while things go left or right or whatever. But I mean, I felt like I was part of some military operation there watching this happen because so many things have to go right, so many things can go wrong, and you're on a time clock.
There was one instance where we kind of took 4 different approaches. We have 4 people on the ground. I'm about the 3rd person out of the chopper. I'm not the lead runner. Those people have sort of taken a trip off to the left, and I was off to the right. And the chick, I don't know exactly what it had done, but I think it had sort of doubled back and gone very far to the right, and I spied it. And it was just one of these where, no, I'm going to get this one. And I just went and got it. But that environment is so tricky to work in.
Why is it tricky?
Well, these ponds, basically you've got a lot of muck. You regularly lose your shoe. You end up you could founder basically in these ponds. The birds are kind of getting along, but a 170-pound human isn't going to make it. And I found that bird and was able to restrain it fine, but I lost my balance and I just decided to sit down. And so I'm sitting down in the mud, holding this bird in front of me, and Mark Bidwell, I think, came up on me, and I'm just laughing. Just laughing. It was hysterical. It was just, again, Dave talked about how stressful the situation is, how amped up you are. And I just found this situation completely humorous because I couldn't do anything.
You couldn't move either.
I couldn't move. I couldn't get up.
Just stuck.
I have to hand this
But he had the bird.
to me, but I had the bird, and I had him safely. And that, and we take great care with those young ones. They're tough, but they're also a bit fragile in a way. And so I actually take a great deal of pride in that moment too, that we did it right. But I found it just funny as all heck. And so I passed the guy off and we did our thing and went on our way, and that bird did fine. So I don't know. To me, that was really the most memorable part of that work.
That's cool.
Yeah.
How about you, Dave?
Oh gosh, I got a lot, but I think one that I guess a little bit like Barry, I found myself laughing as well as I was running up to the bird. Is Megan and I have been out on Matagorda Island.
Megan Ring, colleague of mine at Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center. Been trying to mentor her and train her into some of the techniques that we were using and how we did it. And there was this one family group, and it was like the farthest bird on the island away from us. I mean, it literally was 25 miles from where we were camped. Wow.
And we had to drive up there in a side-by-side just to get up to the site. And this male in this group was one of the smartest SOBs that I think I ever went after. I mean, he would sit there. We had sat on him 2 or 3 times, this family group. And he would sit there away from the spot that I needed him to be while their colt, their young one, would go up there and feed. And he'd just sit there and call. Alarm call that. No, don't do that. Don't do that. And he'd constantly do that. And pretty soon they'd bugger off. Oh. And so the third time we were up there, I was starting to get a little frustrated. And third time we were up there, they had come up to the hole already once. The female and the chick had fed, but I couldn't catch the female because the chick was always in the hole, always in the loop at the same time, so I couldn't fire it because I didn't want to catch 2 at once. And so they had fed out, and then they buggered off and went somewhere else. And so I told Megan, I said, man, this is such a far ride. We got to wait this out. We got to wait for them to come back. They're going to come back here. I know they're going to come back. We're going to sit here for 2 or 3 hours, but they're going to come back. Well, sure enough, a couple hours go by, and then pretty soon they come back, and they're on Megan's side. She's hiding behind this other ridge because it's kind of an exposed spot, and there wasn't room for us to be together. So I'm sitting there talking to her at the radio, and she says, man, they're behind me. I got them over here. Okay. Then they slowly start making their way up to the hole, and they all walk up, and the same thing happens. The female feeds. The chick feeds the same thing, and he sits there and alarm calls back towards Megan, and eventually they come back out. Well, juniors they don't listen. They're like a teenager. I mean, down there on the wintering grounds, and he wants some of that corn, man. So he keeps inching his way back up there, and so Pop starts alarm calling at him again, and he's like, screw you, Pop, I'm going anyway. So he goes up to the hole. And pretty soon he feeds, and then the female goes up there and she feeds and feeds. So he ambles up there finally. He's kind of settled down a bit. He quits alarm calling, and both of those birds fed out, went and sat about 10 yards. And pretty soon the male comes walking up to the hole. And he goes up and he literally walks around the whole set that I had there, and he's looking at it, and he's looking at it. And he backs off and then he looks at it. And he looks at it some more. He's, well, the corn looks pretty good. Finally, he steps in and I caught him. And as I'm running up there, I'm just laughing because I know what's going through that crane's head. He's just like, God dang it! I knew there was something wrong. What the hell? I knew I shouldn't have done it. Here I go. And I was just laughing the whole run up there. So yeah, I caught a smart one. I'm pretty sure.
And you remember that bird? What bird was it?
It is. I can't remember the number, but he's one that trades back and forth between Matagorda Island and Welver.
Oh, is that right?
Yep.
Okay. We'll figure that out later. Maybe we can figure out which bird that was that you.
Oh, the chick. Yeah, absolutely.
I know exactly where it was where he's talking about.
Well, we're going to dig into that. So, you guys have mentioned, your memory, Barry, was up in Wood Buffalo with the
It
chicks.
just happened. Yeah.
Yeah, Dave, your memory is down on the wintering grounds with an adult. Why are we capturing chicks? Why are we capturing adults? How do you make the decisions? What's the goals in capturing different groups of birds in different age classes and such?
Well, I might want to let Dave sort of handle the telemetry questions and sort of the geographic objectives and things like that. One of the things, I sort of want listeners to realize is the study had very large scale, literally large scale geographic objectives at its beginning, at its core, to understand the migratory patterns of this species at a much finer scale than we could have otherwise in decades past.
And just to put it in context for people, we're talking about
Between Canada,
2,500 mile
Exactly.
long geography that's maybe 200 to 300 miles wide,
right?
but with
Huge
500
gap.
or so birds,
Right.
and climbing a little bit, but yeah, huge gaps in knowledge.
Yeah. And speaking of huge gaps, I mean, one of the things that was so apparent to me at the beginning of this is, we'd done so much work on the veterinary side with the captive breeding and eventual reintroduction of this species in other places in the U.S. We had learned so much in captivity, but yet no one had looked at the sort of the health of whooping cranes in the wild. Are there other threats, essentially, smaller, not very visible threats to this species that we really just don't realize because we have not had opportunities to handle them in the past. Mm-hmm. And so slowly, and I think we've also developed a whole slew of questions kind of throughout these phases of this research. And that was something I sort of developed with several others over the course of this study, was to learn a little bit more about the health and diseases of whooping cranes in the wild. Because there's only so much I can take from captivity and sort of transpose that onto, what's the issues that a wild crane is up against. Mm-hmm. And so with regards to the young chicks, they take limited flights when the family begins migrations in the fall. And a number of those birds have some kind of interaction with the oil sands production area in northern Alberta. We don't know what kind of exposure they might have to an industrialized landscape during what the period of time that could be sensitive. We don't know what kind of threats occur throughout that migratory phase. We need a baseline. Mm-hmm. And so from my perspective, and sort of from that, I guess you would call it sort of a biomedical perspective and physiological perspective, is to better understand the species both towards the beginning of its life, on the nesting grounds, the sample unit is the young bird, and then to look at the adults and sort of compare them across ages and see where are differences, if any, or where is the potential threat. So, but that was never the intent of the research at its very beginning, which was to answer different kinds of questions. There was a notion at the beginning is that we would gain more information on the cause-specific mortality of this species. So are there reasons that birds die in this population, anything that is potentially preventable or controllable, that's different than what we know from these reintroduced populations. But unfortunately, the technology and the way we follow those birds wasn't really appropriate to answer that question. We have gotten some insights, but not very many cases. And so, anyways, there are a couple of different series of questions, sort of a finer scale, almost individually oriented, that we began to ask, and I began to sort of pick at over my involvement. But Dave is in a much better position working with the researchers in Northern Prairie and people here in Nebraska who sort of had those initial thoughts.
Yeah, so getting back to the kind of the causes of mortality thing, we still get mortalities. It's just very difficult to ascertain the ultimate cause of that mortality. So I mean that's always been a problem with all kind of geopositional data, is you got to get to it really quick, because in nature things don't last, man. So you end up making a bunch of guesses, or you kind of like circumstantial evidence is oftentimes the best you can do. So, and of course we try and be objective in science best we can. So anyway, we do get the mortality information oftentimes, but yeah. I guess the difference between marking juveniles and marking adults, some of the simplest ones, like we said, adults had never been marked before, so we just needed to get that information, right? But juveniles, in marking a juvenile, their probability of survival is much lower. So you may not get as much data out of them as you do adults. These adults can live for over 30 years in the wild.
Yeah.
So, that's one thing, because if you mark a juvenile, we kind of hoped that our radios would last 3 to 4 years, which is about the time these birds start pairing and maybe think about initiating nests. So you're never going to get nesting information or that type of information by marking juveniles.
So
right?
again, for our listeners, chicks or whooping cranes don't reach sexual maturity until they're around 4 to 5, somewhere in that.
So and we're getting these transmitters, are lasting as with any technology. You have issues here and there, but like on average, I think our first phase were 2.5 years. We averaged. We had some that went, maybe 4 or 5 years, but we had others that only went a year. Mm-hmm. And so it averaged out, I think, about 2.5 years. These new ones we're putting on much better. The new technology, it's a totally different technology that we're using now. We've got several out there that are 6 years and still going. So that's one really important thing. But even basic things like migration, right? I mean, you here at the Platte River, I think the first whooping crane I ever saw here at the Platte River was probably a loner in the midst of a bunch of sandhills, right?
Yeah.
We've learned through time that those are probably subadults that are not behaving as most of the other whooping cranes do. And we've learned that with our juveniles that we've marked in their second year after they return to the breeding grounds with their parents, or close to the breeding grounds with their parents. Oftentimes they just start doing these weird wanderings.
Yeah.
Some go to the breeding grounds with their parents, but others, man, they hang out to the border of North Dakota and Saskatchewan. They'll go over to British Columbia. I mean, they just kind of do these weird wanderings. That's a unique piece of information that you get from marking juveniles, and as they go through year 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, which is different than you're going to get from the adults. But the adults, we're getting some crazy information, like what their reproductive output is. There's individuals that we've marked that I've recaptured and put new radios on. So we have individuals that we've actually monitored for close to 10 years now. So So you get a long history by doing that type of stuff with adults, and some juveniles that we've recaptured and marked in their adulthood as well. So
I think the value of that is you chose the best 2 points that are most accessible in this bird's lifespan, where you have a possibility of marking them. And you think about it, we're nearly cradle to grave, kind of, you filled in a lot of gaps in the natural history and the natural cycle of this bird's life.
Yeah.
And so, no, we don't know what the first month or 2 of life is exactly like, but we can tell you a heck of a lot more between August 1st of their first year and potentially their death.
right.
And fill in an awful lot of holes and learn things that we thought of. And the interesting thing about it, hearing Dave talk about the spring wandering phenomenon of yearlings, is we observe that in the reintroduced populations in Wisconsin, which is a reintroduction to establish a migratory population. And that really wasn't well defined. It was kind of theorized, and we were talking about spring wandering, and it explained why we had birds who should have been gone back to the quote-unquote breeding grounds of central Wisconsin and ended up in South Dakota. So we saw a similar phenomenon. And interestingly, all of those birds from captivity, which are used in the reintroductions, come ultimately from the genetic pool that the remnant wood buffalo Aransas population is.
And it's as simple as, prior to this, most people made the assumption that juveniles followed their parents to the breeding grounds. And that's when they got expelled from the family group. We've got handfuls of instances where we have both the parent and the colt marked, where we can see where that breakup occurs. And like I said, some do follow their parents to the breeding grounds. Others don't. Others break up quite soon, way more than you'd think. I think we had one pair that broke up maybe even in North Dakota before it got to the breeding ground. So it's even pieces of information like that. I mean, I think what I've learned over the course of this, not only just trapping, but also with the data that we've collected, is these birds are like people. They all have different personalities. You can't pigeonhole any individual crane and say, here's what I expect this to do. Yeah, no, they vary. It's adaptive. It's adaptive for them to vary, and it's good that they do vary in their behaviors.
When I started this project, I had no idea I'd learn all the things that I've learned about these birds. You think you sort of have a good handle on it. You read a few things and get the gist of it, but the science, the amount of effort and careful care that's been taken into studying this population, where there are so few of these birds, you actually do get to know these birds pretty well. It's some of the most intimate science I've probably ever run into in my 30-year career working as a photographer in the conservation world, and the dedication just continues to blow my mind. But it's a great opportunity to meet people like you and become friends with people like you two, and it doesn't surprise me then, but it's remarkable what you all are doing.
Well, I really also would really like listeners to understand that this is not just research for research's sake.
No.
This is research, yes, to fill in a lot of knowledge gaps, but that we very much hope are used to conserve the species into the future. I always find it just astounding when Dave and colleagues in USGS and our colleagues in Canada to discuss their use of private lands throughout this flyway is immense.
Yeah.
And we may think the species is safe because, we've protected just these, this sort of stair-step few places as sort of critical. Well, no, they actually need a lot. And they need all of it. And we're identifying threats or seeing how we can mitigate threats if there are areas slated for development and such in different spots. We can inform that conversation and hopefully limit that threat.
So let's talk about, each of you. I'd like to hear from you what you think, one of the biggest challenges is today for these birds, and what one of the biggest hopes is.
I mean, I believe these birds are more resilient than we give them credit for. I've learned that with sandhill cranes especially. I've always, compared to the other species I've worked with, I thought sandhill cranes were very much hardwired into what they do and when they do it. And they are, but if you push them, they can be plastic and they can change. And I think the same thing applies to whooping cranes. But I perceive the biggest threats for them to be probably where they can exist on their wintering grounds, the habitat that's available to them. It's in an ever expanding area of development, and protecting those areas from development and mitigating that development is pretty crucial. When you think about these birds have, 30, 40 miles of coastline tops to basically occupy in their wintering grounds, it's pretty important that is thought about in the future. And then I think the other threat that they face is the same one that most water birds face, and that's wetland drainage throughout the migration corridor. I've watched it in North Dakota. It's happening more and more. I grew up in Iowa, so that's why Barry alluded to he didn't want to let me know that. But and so I saw it in Iowa. I mean, growing up in Iowa, we lost 98% of our wetlands already. And North Dakota is tracking, and South Dakota and all the prairie region in the Central Flyway there's ever more demand for more agriculture. And yeah, pattern tile draining, it's coming. It's coming. If it ain't there, it's coming. If it ain't next to you, it will be. And I love wetlands. I always have loved wetlands. I've loved the ecosystem and the wildlife that occupy it. So to me, that's of critical importance, because you can't have huge gaps in these complexes as these birds migrate, which is why they stop at private property. It's because they may not, depending upon when the weather was right or when they took off and they started migrating, as it gets dark, they're looking down and looking for an acceptable place to spend the night. If you ain't got wetlands there, I mean, we've seen it. We've seen it where they roost in just crop fields, because that's all they got. Well, they're not very safe in those crop fields or in those upland environments. So, I mean, thinking about, the importance of the future for not only wildlife, but humans as well, the important role that wetlands serve in all our lives. And thinking about that before we take out the last one.
Yeah, I'd really echo that. I don't think there's really too much more to add in terms of potential threats, especially in the developed coastal region in Texas. I think there's what is a great hope is the appreciation a lot of people really show for these birds up and down the flyway. I think if that continues to be sort of developed, people become aware, I think that will really, really help things. Interestingly, one of the most, and I hope you do explore this with our Canadian colleagues in a future conversation. One of the things that really struck me about working in Canada and traveling to the north, which I really spent no time in other than through this field work, is, my God, how much change I witnessed during that about 8 years, just in terms of the concerns that people in the north are expressing about how their environment is potentially changing and what new stressors they're confronted with. Mm-hmm. And you have to remember that the Fort McMurray wildfire occurred during the period that we're talking about our work happening. Yeah. Now, we weren't in Fort McMurray, but our team has been impacted by wildfires and smoke keeping us grounded, or the community of Fort Smith, potentially evacuating. Where we were based, where Wood Buffalo National Park headquarters are. So the stress is that a lot of attention gets placed on potential contaminants issues and other things sort of emanating from the oil sands development and bitumen mining. There are other issues as well that are probably just as important, and that is environmental change in the north, which is accelerating with climate change.
along with the water, I think we both agree on this, Barry, is human demand for fresh water is also a future threat as we see cities in Texas grow and grow and grow. More and more fresh water is taken out of the inflows into the bay systems down there, which has an impact on the entire ecosystem that these birds rely upon. So that is a threat that we need to be cognizant of, and it kind of boils back to my whole wetlands as well, because rivers are wetlands too, right? So as far as hope, I think we can't talk about this species without recognizing that it's a great conservation success story. We oftentimes forget that. We don't think about it as much as I think we should, because that took a big group of different people to make that come about. It's people who are birders and love birds just for birds. It's educating the hunting community about being careful, making sure that you don't take an endangered species. It's about communities who revolve around ecotourism. And this is a great iconic species, I think, to pull different factions together to make that a success story. So I think that there's hope in the future, because I hope that we're all starting to get a little better feel for the fact that healthy ecosystems makes healthy people. And we're part of those ecosystems. I hope in the future that grows and that continues. And I think if it does, eventually we'll arrive at an equilibrium that we can all exist with.
Dave espousing the One Health concept. Wow.
And we're not even drinking tequila.
Not yet.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the species has trebled, if I'm not mistaken, during the time I worked with the International Crane Foundation.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure we're just at about that point where the wild population has grown 3 times, which is back to your very first comment about how resilient these birds are.
In spite of us, sometimes.
In spite of us.
Yeah.
And again, the greatest decision fortune was to protect wood buffalo and that core breeding grounds, and have some foresight to provide some protections on a variety of levels. And so that's where bring in everybody else and sort of realize the saving of small pocket wetlands and private lands, et cetera.
I always say to people, there's no finish line in this work. You just
we passed finish lines.
it's
recently.
I know, but
No.
neither of you. I don't see either of you on the golf course, right?
Nor will you ever.
That's true. You got it.
But you're passing on your knowledge and your wisdom. You're not out of the game yet, and we just keep beating that same drum. I think our biggest challenge in a lot of ways is just simply indifference.
Yeah.
We're not knowing at all. And that's what struck me in this project is that there's just a lot of people that have no idea that these birds even exist. They don't know the story. They don't know the history, and they don't know how they're connected to these birds. And I think the work that you all have done together in the tracking partnership and the capturing and just looking at these birds and their health is something that everybody has a stake in, and they each are connected to in some intimate way if you sort of pull on the thread far enough. And to your point about all these private lands here, we have wood buffalo in the north, which is arguably the 2nd or 3rd largest national park in the world that could put Yellowstone in its back pocket and not even notice. And on the south, we've got 30 to 40 miles of coastline, some of it protected under a national wildlife refuge, a lot more of it protected in conservation lands that are on ranch properties and others. But the vast majority in the middle, you just walk up all the states, and all the states, Texas is 90-some% private ownership. Oklahoma, including the tribal lands, is the same. Kansas is the same. Nebraska is the same. Dakotas are almost the same, and then you get into prairie provinces and all of that. Every square acre of wetland, grassland matters to these birds. And that is something that maybe what, you're feeling, Barry, in Canada, which is something I sort of noticed too, and maybe Dave has also, is that in Canada there's more formative conversations around conservation. It's more part of the everyday culture to have these conversations today, whereas here in the States we still struggle with it's nice when it's convenient, but not necessarily part of our everyday.
That actually really impressed me when I worked in Saskatchewan for 4 years, that there was a very different ethos up there when it came to not only that, but a public trust.
Yeah.
That the wildlife are a public trust and that no individual really owns them. They're owned by all. And that was so refreshing, because we struggle with that in North Dakota.
Yeah.
You know, we all think that it's mine. It's on my property. It's mine. No, it's not. It's ours. It's everybody's.
Yeah. I think we can get there.
Well, I think that's where you come into the picture, Mike. I mean, that's where you excel and that's where you're good. It's hard for people to understand in Oklahoma, in the middle of nowhere, where a crane stops for 2 days, that it's important that they have that wetland for them to stop, because people don't see it. They don't see it. They may not know it. So telling that story is what's going to make them understand that I am part of this system.
Yeah.
It does belong to me.
Yeah. Well, we do it together. Just not down the road, but maybe about 30, 40 miles away from here, this little town called Funk, Nebraska. You gotta be careful when you say it.
Yeah.
Most of my dad's relatives farm in that area. Been very careful over the years. So we say it, the locally, they're the Funkites.
So they're not funky.
They're some of them maybe.
Some of them are.
But this year they're having their second annual Crepes and Cranes Festival.
Nice.
Fantastic.
And it's right next to the Funk waterfowl production area, which is in that part of the rainwater basins is the only game in town when it comes to wetlands. But this community has gathered together and recognized that actually isn't just that place over there where those birds go. It's part of their own culture. Now it's part of who they are. Yeah. And they're starting to stand up for these birds and for that place in a sea of corn and beans. I'm starting to see more of those little campfires being lit up and down this corridor and other places in the parts of the country too. But it's very incremental work. You got to have the science. Science does the data, and the data is the story. And we got to tell those stories. I do have one more question on that, and then we're going to wrap up. How do you know that you're done? I mean, you do have a lot of transmitters out on birds now. I don't know what it is now, but somewhere between probably 40 and 50 active transmitters right now on birds.
Yeah, 50 some, yeah.
When you've got enough.
Well, I can take that one, and this is my personal philosophy, I guess, probably more so than anything, and that is, in science, before you start a project, you define clear objectives of that project. What questions are you going to do you hope to answer out of that? Well, if you put on a bunch of transmitters and have not answered those questions, at some point you have to ask yourself, do I have enough information to answer those questions? Because that's always a trade-off in science, right? Do I have enough sample size to adequately address the questions that I put forth? And at some point you do. And to me, it behooves the scientist to then say, okay, now it's time to answer those questions, because inevitably in answering those questions, more are going to arise. New questions are going to arise. So I think that's kind of what we did in this project. So we took it through the first phase. We refer to it as phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1, we used one technology, got to a point, and we actually took a couple years off before we didn't do any captures from 2000 last capture was 2014, and then we reinitiated in 2017, I think. So we took a three-year break in there, and when we restarted that phase 2, it was with a different technology that gave much more frequent information. So the ability to gather locations was at a higher frequency was substantially higher, substantially more. So we had analyzed some of the information to that point, and so we had some questions that this higher frequency data could address. So that's where we began kind of remarking birds again. And then at that point, I would argue since then, we have put on enough transmitters to answer any further questions. So to me, we have not analyzed the data in such a way that any new big questions have popped up yet. So I think it's probably time to sit down and really chew through that data and see, do any new questions arise before we continue. I mean, it's rare. It's rare in wildlife biology to mark, and this is marking with replacements, but even to mark 10% of a population, and I mean that's like, holy smokes, you got 2% of the population, you're exuberant. We've marked a pretty good number of birds here. I think we have the data to answer the questions that we put forth, and I think it's time for us to start really drilling into that data before we continue doing more.
Yeah, it's just going to say that the primary basic biology questions, those big gaps, I think they're being pretty well answered. Mm-hmm. The newer technology that Dave's talking about is really helping answer, or has the ability to answer, much finer scale issues like threats and how do we mitigate when certain things happen or development projects are coming that kind of add to what we had known before, but we had kind of imperfect information for it.
So we're talking about things like new wind farm energy siting, look how do birds particularly.
Yeah, I mean, there's questions at this. I mean, for instance, this new technology allows us to basically sense when a bird takes flight and starts logging locations at every, I think our what we settled on was every 30 seconds. It's taking a GPS location. So at that resolution, you can actually see how a bird is navigating through a section. So if it encounters wind farms, what's its reaction to it? Does it gain elevation? Does it fly around them? What's it do?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and I was going to say that it's not just the X and Y axis, it's the Z. Yep. So we're able to see in 3 dimensions now with that data.
Honestly, those that are already in place, I would argue you're going to have a hard time tearing down, getting them torn down. But I think the more important question is probably what's important for those birds and how to avoid putting them in those places. Yeah. That birds are looking for, the habitat complex that they're looking for. Can we move those wind farms or those solar farms or whatever that threat may be? Can we move it away 10 or 20 miles and eliminate the probability of having that interaction? So
I'd be remiss in not asking you, Barry, about avian flu. And I know we don't need to get into big weeds about it, but I'm getting a lot of questions. I'm sure you all are too, about avian flu. And I mean, when this podcast airs, will probably be after migration season. Mm-hmm. So we'll maybe know a lot more then about what.
Well, geez, Mike, how much do you want to know?
Well, I think the thing that
the situation now.
What's generally the situation, and what have you learned, and how concerned are you about this particular disease and its effectiveness?
The situation is pretty concerning. Now, specifically for cranes, yes, I'm concerned. I've been a member of the Whooping Crane Health Advisory Team, a group of veterinarians and wildlife disease experts, for well over 20 years. This group's been together since 1994. And I don't think we've seen kind of a threat like this, high pathogenic avian influenza, ever before. And now it's on a global scale. So 3 winters ago, we lost 8,000 Eurasian cranes in Israel. Actually, just prior to that die-off, there were mass mortality events of demoiselle cranes in India from the same virus. Once that virus established itself in the old world and made its way to North America the following year. We expected the worst a couple of years ago. We do know that our shorebirds were hammered. Some of our waterfowl species were impacted. Amazingly, sandhill cranes and the whooping crane 2 years ago, when that H5N1 virus was found in North America, weren't really impacted. Individual birds were all that were recorded. But the following winter, we had die-offs again in East Asia, in Japan and Korea, involving 2 other endangered species, the hooded crane and the white-naped crane, involving well north of 1,000 deaths between the 2 species, probably about 1,500 birds. And now we have issues in the eastern United States with sandhill crane deaths in Indiana. I don't know the details, but I was informed today that we're talking hundreds, if not over 1,000 deaths. Mm-hmm. That is concerning. Could the issue, the disease issue in a numerous species such as sandhill crane spill over into this endangered population? There are some things that give me hope, quote unquote, with regards to whooping cranes specifically, is that they're still not very numerous. They don't generally occur in highly dense concentrations where passing a virus is an issue. I think we've lived through COVID. We know what the dynamics kind of are like for these viruses, and they're somewhat similar. But this issue has been around since the late 90s. Its impacts on all manners of different wildlife, now that it's jumped to mammals and it's in our dairy cattle. Throughout the United States, we've lost tens of millions of domestic poultry, untold numbers of wildlife of a great diversity of species. It's pretty darn concerning.
It's not going away.
And it's not going away. It's not something you can vaccinate yourself out of. It's not going to just burn itself out. These are flu viruses. So hopefully over time, the virus becomes a little bit more benign. But right now, we're seeing it mutate and being more adapted and causing issues in all these different species. And it's a bit concerning.
Which is what viruses do, right?
That's what viruses do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not aware of anything in the central flyway population right now, but
Crane-wise.
crane-wise.
Yeah.
So we'll hope we can get through this month.
Yep. Well, let's end on a lighter note.
Yes, I think that might be necessary.
When was the first time you saw whooping crane, Dave?
Like I said, I believe it was here working on sandhill cranes in the Platte River. Yeah, it was an interesting experience because I believe that same year I caught a melanistic sandhill that was about 80% white in my rocket netting, just south of the trust. Actually, it was one of those birds that just a single whooping crane with a bunch of sandhills, and it attracted a lot of attention. I remember that. I was rocket netting actually just west of here, about a mile, in a pasture, and set up in the morning, and we're watching, and I'm looking to the south of us because I'm always looking around for cranes to come in, and I see this caravan of vehicles. Must have been 15 or 20 of them lining South Platte Road, Platte River Road there. What the heck is going on there? You know, the parade? And I don't know, I went back to doing what I was doing, and a few minutes later, I seen this white thing cruising for my decoy spread that I had in front of my rocket net. And sure enough, here comes the great white one right into my rocket net spread. And I turn around and look, and I see the caravan heading right for me. Well, I was trying to operate at the utmost secrecy down here, and the last thing I wanted was a bunch of craniacs watching me capture sandhill crane. So I actually spooked that bird out of there real quickly. So yeah, that was, I guess, my first experience with the great white one here at the Platte River.
What about you, Barry?
Well, do captive whooping cranes count?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, given my profession, it has to be that. Actually, the first time I remember sort of touching and intimately interacting with a whooping crane, I was a veterinary student. And I was visiting the International Crane Foundation, and my mentor, Dr. Julie Langberg, she was actually both ICF's veterinarian as well as an instructor at the university. Knew who I was, knew my interests in wildlife medicine. And I was, as I recall, just up there for the day. And sometimes as a trainee, you do a lot of watching. You don't, you hope you get a chance to do some real hands-on, learning. And she said, oh yeah, we need to get a blood sample from this whooping crane. Why don't you do it? And I was stunned that she would allow me to take this responsibility. She clearly knew I knew how to do this, safely, but it almost felt like an honor. It's when your teacher shows faith and trust in you. That's a great thing.
It's hard for me when people ask me if I know Barry or if I know Dave. I get a twinkle in my eye and I say, yeah, I know these guys. But
Maybe a little too well.
I need a few hours to really understand them. I just want to say thanks, both of you, for who you are, what you do, for the friendships that we have together. And I want to thank you for being a part of this podcast today. These are the Whooping Crane Chronicles. Appreciate you all joining. Stay tuned for the next one.